let's go ahead and get started. Welcome again to part 2 of this series, The Spirit of Wealth, and I'm just going to dive right in since we're starting a few minutes late. Well, last week we formulated some problems around wealth expressed by this painting from the creative hand of the Venetian master Titian. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's is the story behind this painting. But what does that actually mean in language for the 21st century? That we face a conundrum. How do we reconcile our obligations toward an outer life of earning and accumulation, both necessary, with the inner life of meaning? This is a problem because we recognize within ourselves what sociologists and psychologists call cognitive dissonance, or holding simultaneously incompatible beliefs. To put it bluntly, we have a love-hate relationship to money, which we define as wealth. We know we need it. All of us, if we're honest, would like more of it, believing that if we only had more of it, we would finally feel secure and at peace. Our own experience both confirms and contradicts this idea. Numerous studies indicate that after an initial adrenaline rush from increased income or shopping, we soon go back to a default setting of emotional and psychological security and well-being. Billionaires, believe it or not, also suffer with the fear of loss, experience chronic anxiety and insecurity, and yes, even on occasion, feel a sense of lack. They too have a default setting when it comes to wealth. At the same time that we desire more money, we worry about its effect on our characters and its effect on the characters and behaviors of our friends and family. Will more money corrupt us? After all, we see so clearly how it corrupts others who, in our view, accumulate too much, who become, quote, filthy rich, unquote. But Titian's work and others we saw in our last presentation call us to see that money in and of itself is devoid of any moral value. Only in the manner it is used will it bring meaning or corruption. And that brings us to today's topic. Now, I know I said last presentation I would offer examples of people who gave to Caesar what was Caesar's and to God what was God's, but I would like to begin with a mythical story from the classical Greek culture. Recently, I presented before a select group of people the idea that instead of rejecting the spiritual and philosophical traditions we grew up with, that we should come to peace with them and perhaps learn to understand them anew so that we can once again receive their wisdom. Now, we in the West have been formed by two main traditions, the classical Greek and Roman traditions, and even to a greater degree by the Judeo-Christian traditions, regardless of whether we consciously follow either of these traditions. And so I invite you this morning to put aside any prejudices about our ancient myths and legends and see if there's some valuable teaching in them. His name means forethought. He formed us from clay and gave us life. And when he saw that we lived in darkness and constant fear of other creatures and in cold, damp caves, he gave us fire, which allowed us to develop ourselves creatively, intellectually, and culturally. But he also gave us another gift, perhaps the most important. He gave us hope, so that we could utilize our growing knowledge of the arts and sciences, develop skills that would lift us up out of a state of moronic thuggery and into cooperative communities, living together, forming villages, towns, and ultimately cities. His name is Prometheus. His creating us and giving us the arts and sciences as well as hope so that we would continue striving to develop our potentials came at a very heavy price. The gods, namely Zeus, did not want humans to have technologies and the freedom and independence they would bring. Zeus was so angry that Prometheus had tricked him and given knowledge previously reserved only for the gods that he had Prometheus chained. Zeus devised a hideous form of torture Each day, an eagle would visit the chained god and tear out his liver. But overnight, the liver would grow back, and the torture would begin again the following day for eternity. Here is another extraordinary depiction of the god's disdain. Besides revealing Zeus as rather monstrous in character, this story and the art expressing it begs the question: why wouldn't the gods want us to have their knowledge so that we could develop to our full potential? Well, in the most ancient traditions from the Near East, the gods didn't want to work, so they created humans to be their slaves, to tend their gardens so that they wouldn't have to. As with all slave owners throughout history, these gods wanted us to remain ignorant, because with knowledge comes the desire for independence and self-empowerment. But within these same traditions, another reason appeared. The gods, like those of us who are parents, wanted to protect their human creations from the pain and the suffering that acquiring wisdom and knowledge often brings. Don't touch the stove, dear, it might burn you. So these traditions contain their own form of dissonance, of seemingly incompatible ideas. Today, we will look at two historical persons, or legends, as some historians believe, from ancient times who became popular subjects in medieval, Renaissance, and Baroque art, primarily because of the way their wealth was used. The philosopher Jacob Needleman, in his book, Money and the Meaning of Life, observes the following. Unique among all the legendary figures of our culture, Solomon represents the blending in one individual of godliness and worldliness. Hence, a great symbol rises before us, the king and the magician. Now, almost every ancient spiritual teaching in history speaks to us of the divine king. It is a universal symbol of the challenge before every man or woman to live simultaneously in two worlds, the inner world of the spirit and the outer world of matter. Hold on one second. I may have skipped something that is quite valuable and important that I wanted to say here. I want to go back real quick to Prometheus. I think maybe the Promethean myth may have sounded a little familiar to you because it's similar to another ancient story familiar to many of us. Let me present its Judeo-Christian version. Now, we're all familiar with the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, where the first couple are created by God to tend a garden. And they are told that they can have eternal life by eating from one tree, but are forbidden to eat from the tree that would bring them the wisdom and knowledge reserved for God. They are tempted by a serpent who offers them this knowledge, the knowledge of the heavens in the form of fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And here is the divine response after Adam and Eve require this knowledge. Then the Lord God said, "See, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil." In other words, wise, having the wisdom of the gods. And now he might reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. In other words, he might become godlike. Therefore, the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. So for those of you who've spent any length of time in this community, you'll be quite familiar with my description of truth as being more both and than either or. What does this look at Prometheus and the Adam and Eve story teach us? For one thing, acquiring knowledge and wisdom often requires personal suffering. But it also teaches us that there is a time to obey and there is a time to rebel, especially in the pursuit of wisdom. There is a time to submit to traditional teachings, and there is a time to reform those teachings. This is how wisdom in the world expands. And art often is where our traditions are reformed. So let me pick up again with the introduction to the story of Solomon. Solomon, according to Jacob Needleman, is a model for all of us in how to bridge this conflicting world, these conflicting worlds of Caesar and God. King Solomon famously asked not for riches or power, but wisdom. And by seeking wisdom passionately, he was granted great wealth and power. Now, more skeptical scholars would simply say because he pursued wisdom, naturally the chances were great that he would acquire great wealth, and with great wealth comes great power. Simply a matter of cause and effect without the need of the generosity of a god. But let's adopt a more mature perspective, that of the philosopher, the seeker, that of the artist. Here, the artist Govert Flink expresses the idea that Solomon seeking wisdom is the noble path that all leaders, and you and I for that matter, should follow. And there is another great monarch who shared in Solomon's desire for wisdom, and her story is linked to that of Solomon's. The Queen of Sheba is mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 10 as visiting Solomon after she heard of his great wisdom and his great wealth. She is represented here as dark-skinned, which was rare in European art. But historically, it's more accurate since the region of Sheba is now identified as modern-day Yemen in Southwest Arabia. And it possibly also refers to Ethiopia in East Africa, which is a very short boat ride from Yemen across the Red Sea. So perhaps in ancient times, those kingdoms were linked. Here is the story recounted in the Hebrew book of 1 Kings. When the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, she came to test him with hard questions. She came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue, with camels bearing spices and very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she told him all that was on her mind. Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing hidden from the king that he could not explain to her. When the Queen of Sheba had observed all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his officials and the attendance of his servants, their clothing, his valets, and his burnt offerings that he offered at the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. In other words, it took her breath away. So she said to the king, "The report was true that I heard in my own land of your accomplishments and of your wisdom, but I did not believe the reports until I came and my own eyes had seen it. Not even half had been told me. Your wisdom and prosperity far surpassed the report that I had heard." Then she gave the king 120 talents of gold, a great quantity of spices and precious stones. Never again did spices come in such quantity as that which the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. Meanwhile, King Solomon gave to the Queen of Sheba every desire that she expressed, as well as what he gave her out of Solomon's royal bounty. Then she returned to her own land with her servants. Now, of course, historians on the more cynical side will say this depiction is merely one monarch, establishing a strategic political and economic relationship with another monarch. But the spiritual traditions see it as something far more significant. They see it as a story of the proper use of wealth. Solomon sought wisdom first and was given great wealth and power as a result. In this tapestry, we see the Queen of Sheba testing King Solomon. She has used her wealth to seek wisdom. Artists have interpreted the legend of Solomon and the Queen to teach us that wisdom seeks wealth so that wealth can seek greater wisdom. Solomon is also a fitting guide for us because tradition has him authoring some well-known books of wisdom, namely Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Proverbs is a collection of wise aphorisms fused with what I would call can-do optimism. But Ecclesiastes appears, in contrast, in my opinion, as pure cynicism. Polar opposites in character, yet both recognizable as wisdom literature. Let's look briefly at some excerpts from these texts. Proverbs answers the question, why bother pursuing wisdom when one can use wealth to pursue pleasure? Solomon begins Proverbs extolling the virtues of a life of wisdom. He says, get wisdom, get insight. Do not forget nor turn away from the words of my mouth. Do not forsake her, and she will keep you. Love her, and she will guard you. The beginning of wisdom is this. Get wisdom, and whatever else you get insight. Prize her highly, and she will exalt you. She will honor you if you embrace her. She will place on your head a fair garland. She will bestow on you a beautiful crown. Wisdom is personified as a feminine being who, if honored, will bestow the greater things of life and perhaps help one better preserve their wealth. Here are a few other famous proverbs. Precious treasure remains in the house of the wise, but the fool devours it. A lot of Proverbs, in my opinion, reads like good old salt of the earth common sense, doesn't it? Here's another. Oppressing the poor in order to enrich oneself and giving to the rich will lead only to loss. Is that necessarily true? Let's look at some others. The highway of the upright avoids evil. Those who guard their way preserve their lives. And pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Well, there's some good, sound wisdom for us here, right in line with what most of the personal development gurus teach us. I think some of us could find exceptions to these teachings. Supposedly, the same person who wrote these words, the book of Proverbs, also wrote these from Ecclesiastes. I saw all the deeds that are done under the sun and see all is vanity and a chasing after wind. I said to myself, come now, I will make a test of pleasure, enjoy myself, enjoy yourself. But again, this is also vanity. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil. And this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done and the toil I had spent in doing it. And again, all was vanity and a chasing after wind. And there was nothing to be gained under the sun. Friends, Ecclesiastes is a book about the wisdom acquired by trying to use wealth to live fully in the world, to experience all the pleasures and material things that wealth can buy. This is how many use their wealth. Ecclesiastes is about the hard and painfully acquired wisdom from such use of wealth. No matter how many times we are told material things cannot bring happiness, most of us still can only learn the truth about material things by acquiring them. Solomon acquired his wisdom, according to Ecclesiastes, not so much from books, but from living. In that way, it differs from Proverbs, which reads like aphorisms meant to help us avoid the painful lessons of experience. Not Ecclesiastes. The teachings in that book sound like someone who has learned life's lessons the hard way, through the pain of the refining fires of experience, which makes a mockery of all truisms. So Solomon acquired his wisdom the same way we acquired our own wisdom. by immersing himself in the experience of life, including all of its striving and all of its disappointments. Here's another depiction of the long conversations with the Queen of Sheba, sharing with each other their hard-fought and won wisdom. Now take a good look at Solomon. Take a good look at him. He certainly appears as if he is sharing with the queen lessons from Ecclesiastes and not the lessons from Proverbs. This artistic expression of the traditional meeting of these two monarchs and other artworks like it reveal a couple of important ideas. Wealth can buy us relationships that enhance our lives, as these two seem to enhance one another's lives. And wealth may not bring lasting meaning and contentment in and of itself, but if used properly, it can bring us wisdom, which does provide a certain level of meaning and contentment. Perhaps this is the greatest and most proper use of wealth, acquiring wisdom. I think we can all relate to Solomon's painfully wrought wisdom. For example, we were taught that marriage would fulfill us. It really didn't. We were taught that a certain income would make us happy and feel secure. It really didn't. And we were taught that a family raising children would satisfy us. And even though we love our children, we still find our souls restless at times, don't we? Traditions in East African, Judaic, and Christian history, as well as Islam, have it that Solomon and the Queen of Sheba either married or had a romantic relationship that resulted in a child. In fact, the monarchs of Ethiopia trace their lineage to the fruit of this romantic relationship. Even though this great sculptural relief you're looking at right now is from Italy, it hints at that idea, the marriage of two great minds who sought, above all else, wisdom. Wealth buys experiences which can bring wisdom, even if painfully learned. And if we are honest, wealth can buy significant relationships and even a certain amount of love. That is certainly hinted at in the traditions about Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. But it also teaches that the most valuable relationships are the ones that make us wiser. If we can learn anything from this art and the traditions behind them, it is that wealth, though dangerous if used carelessly, can buy us the most precious gifts of life. So perhaps we should look at our own wealth, defined, I would say, as our free time and our resources, including money and our relationships, and use such wealth to purchase one of life's greatest gifts, wisdom. Friends, how could you use your wealth right now in such a way? I invite you to ponder that question until we explore more of the spirit of wealth in our next meeting. Well, friends, at this time, I'm going to open it up for comments or questions. So the floor is open. Fire away.